This is going to be a slight extra addition to the week one brief summary on Patrick Lecture 242, the meaning of political systems. I found myself struggling last night when I made the first video with how to address this topic. I got myself into the weeds, unable to distinguish politics and the details of politics from the divine spirits, etc. And during a discussion with another person, I related a story. And upon reflection, I realized that that story wasn't true. And so this morning I researched it. Took me a while, took 20, 30 minutes. But once I had reconstructed it, I thought it was a really good example of how people grab onto things and hold them. And even despite objective evidence that it's not true, they may even hold it tighter. So here's my story. I'm going to have to introduce a few things that may sound random, but bear with me, please. My brother, bless his soul, was 3.5 years younger than me, different personality. He had practically a photographic memory for details and facts. I do not. Throughout our lives, he could tell me events about my own childhood that I did not remember. And I would listen to him like he was talking about somebody else. And yet I remember parts of the details. And it was stunning. I didn't remember what he was talking about, but I could reconstruct the feeling of what he was talking about. I had already begun to realize by that time that my memory is for the feeling, for the energy of a conversation. I can relate that. He couldn't. He could relate the facts, the details. He could relate a transcript recording of a conversation, but he didn't feel into the energy of it. I, on the other hand, felt into the energy of it and forgot who, what, when, where, and the actual topic discussed. It made it difficult for me to converse with people. It also made it easy for them to argue with me because they had command of the facts, and I just knew what happened on an energetic, emotional level. I worked that out over time, but that plays into this story. I'm not going to get into why I was relating this story because that I can't even remember how I got there. But here was the memory that I had. The visceral memory was of sitting in a specific classroom. And because I was a military kid, year to year we changed. So a classroom meant a year. I didn't even get confused. I knew that in X year I was sitting in X classroom because the following year was in a different city. I remember being in a specific classroom with a bunch of kids staring at the clock and waiting for a specific time to happen because someone was going to be executed. Later, when I told that story, apparently what happened is I conflated. I couldn't remember the details, so I took another detail that I remembered and I mashed it into the story. And I thought the detail was that in 1962, Adolf Eichmann was executed in Israel. And since that was a worldwide event, that would certainly be the event I would remember. And so I conflated that with this memory of being in my 6th grade classroom in California, staring at the clock with this feeling of dread in the room, horror, dread, fascination, sixth graders. When telling this story, I had this feeling something wasn't right. I don't know why. So I went online and I checked my facts. Eichmann was executed in 62. In 62, I was in a different classroom, in a different location. I was absolutely certain that I had the feeling right. So I kept researching and researching, and it took a while. And finally, what I discovered was in 1960, which is the year I would have been sitting in that classroom in the spring, a man named Carroll Chessman was executed in California. I was living in California. He was executed at 10 o'clock, not noon. So we wouldn't have been at lunch. We would have been in class. And for something of something like that, they wouldn't have dismissed the kids just because an event was happening. But here's my point. Sixth graders being a little gory. We all listened to our parents. We would have heard the news. And there's a fascination with such events. It's a very big adult event to kill someone at a specific time. It's bizarre, the formality of an execution. So I don't think we were ghoulish, but we were kids, and we're staring at the clock because at 10 o'clock, this thing is going to happen. We didn't know what to do about it. It wasn't a discussion. Teacher didn't know what to do about it. So those are 2 or 3 different layers already. And I'm going to add another few layers. Chessman was executed because he had kidnapped and hurt a couple of people. I'm not trying to minimize that, but he didn't murder them, he hurt them. And he was convicted under what was called the Lindbergh Baby Law, which was enacted after Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator who flew across, first to fly across nonstop across the Atlantic. Later on, his baby was kidnapped and it was killed during the kidnapping, even though that was inadvertent. And the penalties weren't harsh enough at that time for an accidental death. And so there was a law passed that if you kidnapped someone, even if you didn't kill them, you could be executed. The death penalty might apply. This, of course, is controversial because it's controversial. So there was that debate that would have raged in the newspapers, in perhaps parental discussions. And another wrinkle was that my maiden name was often mistaken for Lindbergh, and my father's first name was Charles. And so from the time I could read history, there was confusion between me and Charles Lindbergh's family. So there would have been all these invisible threads connecting me to this story that are not easy to reconstruct. I've worked at various details of this kind of thing over the years. So when this came together in this particular story, it was like Christmas lights came on, fairy lights came on. Here's my point. If I wasn't a person who did a lot of self-examination, if I didn't honor this little thing in the back of me that says, I don't know about that story, something doesn't ring right, let's check our facts. If I wasn't that kind of person, I could easily espouse that story, hold on to that story, and use that story as an example of, and this is where forcing currents come in, an example of whatever I wanted it to be an example of. Now, why am I telling this story? A lot of our political discourse comes down to our interpretation of events, our analysis interpretation. And we very often discount our emotional interpretation of events, a place where we conflate facts either because we want to or because they got conflated and we have no particular interest to unconflate them, to unattach them. And they start to gain momentum. Well, when that happens in a group and the group starts to use these facts and support beliefs with these facts, the momentum becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. This lecture, Patrick Lecture 242, The Spiritual Meaning of Political Systems, addresses not those kinds of distortions, but the reality that all political systems, all systems of government contain divine truth and distortion. so that no one system is wrong. It may be right for one group of people in a specific level of development, but not right for another group. And yet we point back and forth. You should do this. This is the right way. We make it into right, wrong. We demean other people for selecting a form of government that, let us say, for instance, we have outgrown. So one of the systems that is mentioned, and we'll go into that in following weeks, is the feudal system, monarchy feudal system, where you have peasants and you have a lord, and the peasants just do their job, and the Lord takes care of whatever the Lord takes care of. And that represents a form of development similar to childhood, where the kids do their thing and the parents do their thing. And there's a lack of taking responsibility by the children because that's not their job. And they don't have the information, they don't have the education, and they don't have the responsibility, and they also don't have the authority to do anything about it. So leave it up to the head guy, the boss, the parent, whatever. And that happens in society as well. And then the kids grow up and they want more say in their governing. They want more say in the outcome of decisions. They want to take on more responsibility, even though they may at some point be immature, but they want to, and it's part of development. And parenting is about figuring out what you can give them that they won't mess up so badly that they'll get hurt, but that they can begin to manage. For instance, an allowance, increasing allowance, allowing them to go out for X amount of time. You have to be back. These are the rules. It's a give and take, messy process. Their rules are easy to slap onto these situations. I would like to suggest that new age parenting is just a lot of work because you got to think through every situation. Now, I'm getting a little far afield. I want to get back to what this lecture is about. The lecture suggests that we self-govern and that our way of self-governing makes us amenable to more public aspects of self-governing. The way I like to govern myself is the way I like to be governed. It's how I like society to govern itself. I advocate what works for me to others. Now, in that advocation, that's where we get into trouble because there's a divine truth in that and there's distortions in that. Now, there are many other stories that occur to me because I've had to, as I have said, because I don't remember facts and figures and I remember feelings, I've had to really figure out how all this stuff fits together and remember my truth of the emotional, energetic reality, despite facts that don't exactly fit, partly because I ignored the facts and I went for the feeling, even as a child. And there's a connection there, but it has to be very delicately applied. It's a lot of work. Self-governing is a lot of work. This spiritual path that you are on because you're reading Pathfic lectures and or listening to this is work. And what I find is that a lot of the feedback I get from participants, students, whatever, is it's too much work. And there's a tendency in human nature, and it's mentioned over and over in this lecture, it's a tendency to look for the right way. And the minute you are trying to find the right way, you invisibly create the wrong way. So this is how the divine truth that there is a divine way, not right, but divine way, a way that is in alignment with spiritual law. But we simplify that. We simplify it into right and wrong. And once we do that, we create boundary lines. We create the potential for distortion because now we can point and we can blame. And we want to be on the right side rather than be willing to explore the truth in any given situation. So what I thought was this, that it's going to be hard for me to keep politics out of these discussions this month. It was an invitation I put out, and now I'm going to have to hedge that invitation. And when this story came to me, and I realized, whoa, that's where political misconceptions come from. Now, I could relate political misconceptions that I've had. I've had a lot of them. But when I thought I knew what I was talking about, I could argue and I could advocate strongly from my point of view. And then a few years later, you uncover some more facts and you realize you were wrong. You were misinformed. Sometimes you were even being used. Now that creates a feeling of resentment and anger, and sometimes a blow to our pride, our dignity, and our sense of reputation. To eat our words is a humbling event, and we don't want to do it. And so sometimes we double down. My impetus this month is going to be to support people in honoring the divine truth of the other, of themselves and of the other, and not being ensnared in the defensive systems, in the pride, self-will, and fear that comes up in all human events that prevents us from being willing to simply look at what is with new eyes. There's a phrase that it takes a mensch, it takes a wise person to do that. And we're not always wise. We may be foolish one day and wise the next. And that means we have to basically claim our foolishness. So this is my public way of claiming my foolishness, of saying I was at a world-shattering event when I wasn't, when it was more, I'm not going to use the word petty, it was more localized and it was more intricate and finessed than I gave it credit for. So this is how sometimes we try to borrow world events to make ourselves more sure of our feelings, to make the package look better, to make the story simpler. And that's when distortions naturally find a home. So I thought this was perhaps a better illustration of an introduction to this lecture. So here we are, little addendum to week 1, Patrick Lecture 242, the spiritual meaning of political systems, and welcome to the month of October 2024 in a world that has a lot of strife in it, trying to thread our way through. Thanks for listening.